Hello and welcome back. Our guest for this segment of Arts Talk is James McGrath Morris, and we're talking about his new book, Eye on the Struggle, about Ethel Payne, the First Lady of the Black Press. So, Mr. McGrath Morris, can you tell us why do you call her the First Lady of the Black Press?
Well, actually, I don't call her that. That is the subtitle of the book. No, you're right. But that's a title that was given to her long before she died, because of her significance. There were three African Americans who were first accredited to the White House Press Corps: Louis Latour, Alice Dunningham, and Ethel Payne.
Okay.
So in order, she would really have been the second, but she became such a significant reporter and such a pioneer in her reporting. It wasn't just domestically. In 1955, she begins to link the black freedom struggle with the struggle for decolonization, self-determination around the world. So she went to Africa a dozen times, traveled around the world, and she became, in some sense, an ambassador of the black press because she was so closely identified that she was named that. And after her death in 2002, the U.S. government issued a postage stamp in her honor. But again, reflecting this segregation of history, there were 4 stamps issued that year to women journalists. The first 3 were white, the 4th was Ethel Payne. All 3 of the white women had biographies written about them, and none had been written about Ethel Payne.
But you've corrected that.
Well, I hope so.
Thank you. And in your biography, you also have a picture of her with Nelson Mandela. Can you tell us the story that goes behind that picture?
She started journalism very late in life, when she was 40. And so when she retired, she self-syndicated a column, but being free of the strictures of journalism, she became much more an activist. She worked with Winnie Mandela on ending apartheid in South Africa. This was a cause she picked up as early as the 1950s, long before many Americans were paying attention to it. A U.S. ship, a naval ship, was sent to South Africa, a desegregated ship. The U.S. government was ordering the black soldiers to obey the apartheid laws of South Africa, meaning a black soldier who had won the right to go to any bathroom in the South was now being ordered by its government to go back to a bathroom labeled colored, and she reported on that.
Wow.
So in 1990, a year before her death, she went to South Africa to interview Nelson Mandela shortly after his release from prison. And the photograph shows her standing with him, and he's in a bathrobe. And just to give you a sense of her sense of humor, she'd written in her notes that many people got to interview Nelson Mandela. I'm the only one who did so while he was in his PJs.
Wonderful. We are interviewing Mr. McGrath Morris in front of an audience of law students, and I understand that Jameson has a question.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you talk a little bit about Miss Payne's personal life and maybe how she balanced that against being this icon?
Well, she had a tough personal life. One of the things about just start off with being a woman in the 1950s, pursuing a career was off-putting to many men. If you've seen the show Mad Men, you can see a lot of the attitudes towards women. But she had 2 strikes against her. She was African American and female. And that put her in a difficult bind personally, because many of the men she met in the course of her professional life, if they got interested in her, they may not have said this directly, but the subtext was, you're going to give up this reporting foolishness, right, if we expand this relationship. So she gave up having a personal romantic life in return for her work. And that, I think, was hard on her. And I thought at the end of her life that she dies, to my mind, very much alone. At least that's what I thought. But as I did my research, I discovered this huge cadre of young women for whom she played an important role as a mentor. And some of them are anchors like Maureen Bunyan, or famous journalists like Barbara Reynolds, who went on to great careers. And what she would do is she would help them get a job. And then she'd show up right away when they had the job, and she'd say to them, be quality. Meaning, you're now in a position of opening up the door for other people. And in return, these women became really devoted to Ethel Payne in a way that what struck me is when I first met them, they referred to themselves as nieces. Well, I thought, oh my goodness, I've really failed in my research. I didn't know that she had nieces, then this many. And she referred to herself as their aunt. She would leave notes to that effect. And what that did is it reflected the incredible closeness of these relationships. So while she didn't have her own natural family for not having married, at the end of her life, she still was surrounded by this just wonderful, warm group of people. She died with very little money, and so some of them who had met with great success, I discovered, would send over a cleaning lady as a Christmas present, or would take her to meals or do all kinds of things, and they stood by her then. But you're right, it was an enormous personal cost. The other thing about being a woman back then is we forget how much times have changed. Imagine her in the lily white all-male press corps, standing up and saying, "Mr. President, Mr. President," and the president recognizes her. And she begins asking a tough question. What does she see? She sees a sea of white male faces turning around and looking at her in a world of intense segregation. This takes a lot of courage. I would have just been stuttering and incapable of asking a question. So being a woman was really a very big question in terms of writing this book and trying to describe that, what happened to her.
Just to follow up on that, you had mentioned at some point about contacting her family.
Yes.
So tell us who's left.
Well, the one that was most important of a direct family was a rear admiral named James A. Johnson, and he figures a great deal in the book because in 1959 he was in school in Chicago and wanted to go to the Capitol Page School. U.S. Congress maintains a school for kids, and these kids in return for going to school work as pages. And you may have seen them on TV. They sit on the floor and they run bills and things to different...
And there was once a Page scandal, I think.
Well, there was. That was many years later, but
Okay,
this is long before the Page scandal with Congressman Bauman. And so he came to Washington on the premise that he was going to be offered this Page job. When the Southern congressmen, and remember, Southern Democrats controlled every major committee in the House and Senate. When they got wind that an African American was about to become the first black Page, they put a stop to it.
Oh.
And so what Ethel Payne was able to work out is a group of congressmen found out that if you work for Congress, you could go to the Page School. So each of them took a little bit of their budget and each shared hiring him to work as a messenger for their offices. So he was able to graduate as a page. He never was allowed on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, but his education at the Page School turned into a career as a medical doctor and a U.S. Rear Admiral in the Navy.
Wow.
And there's photographs in a lot of the story of James Johnson.
And you were able to interview him.
Oh yes, yeah, yeah. He lives in San Diego. The problem, and this is a little bit writerly issue, most of the people who are alive today who would know Ethel Payne would have known her in her later years. The peak of her career is the 50s and 60s. So as a writer, you have to be careful. Just because you have this wealth of information, you don't want to end up the book being really long about the less important part of her career.
Right.
So most of the interviews help me understand her character rather than the specific events.
I see. Yes, and Dominique?
Yes.
So when you're writing an article about, a biography about a journalist, how do you let their articles tell you about who they are as a person?
That's a great question.
Well, it is an interesting question. I do something a little differently than a lot of people do writing about journalists. It's the technique I've developed writing several books about journalists, is I try to let their journalism tell the story rather than having it be passive. So when I have Ethel Payne go to Little Rock to cover the desegregation battle, I don't have her say she later reported or give a long excerpt from her reporting. I weave it into the narrative. So when she's walking down the streets of Little Rock and describing it, I use her descriptions. I don't appropriate them, but I use her descriptions to move the dynamic forward. I think there are ways to do it. Ethel Payne struggled with the fact that, and this is maybe part of discovering her personality, that she couldn't be objective as a reporter in the way we think of reporters being objective. And why was that? Because she felt she was part of the story. She got up in Washington, D.C. in the morning, just merely getting a cab, finding a bathroom, or finding a restaurant in a highly segregated city meant that segregation was part of everything. So every question she asked of the president was part of advancing civil rights. So instead she adopted a notion of fairness, and she was extraordinarily fair in her reporting. But you can see that she uses techniques to let the segregationists hang themselves by their own words as opposed to resorting to vitriolic adjectives. And what you see in those moments, in many respects, is her upbringing and her mother. I have a photograph in the book of her with Henry Kissinger, somebody she would not have liked, or Ronald Reagan. And she's smiling and being polite. And if I could draw a thought bubble above the photograph, it would be, remember what Mama said, you be polite to these people. And I think that comes through in her journalism. She didn't feel any need to bring up vitriolic vocabulary or forms of hatred to advance her cause. And I think you see that in her choice of words.
What's your sense of the white politician that she perhaps respected or liked the most?
Well, it's an Alice in Wonderland world in the 1950s. People have forgotten that LBJ and JFK are the ones who gutted the 57 Civil Rights Act. They were running for president, and they feared being too far forward on civil rights. The hero of the day was the man who we've learned to hate later, was the Vice President, Richard Nixon. Republicans thought in 1957, now you have to remember 57 is only 25 years after 32, when African Americans had moved to the Democrats, that they could win them back. And so in some respects, for that brief shining moment, Ethel Payne's hero, well, hero is too strong a word, but the one she saw the most promise was Richard Nixon.
Fascinating.
Isn't it?
Yes, very fascinating. Does anybody else in the audience have a question? Yes,
I think this
Marcus?
gentleman does.
I do, thank you. My question is, obviously Ethel Payne covered many interesting and monumental moments and individuals. Could you give us a sense of what you feel might have been her most valued experience, and perhaps why?
Her most valued experience, I think, there are two things. One, the specifics, being on the front lines of the civil rights movement in Montgomery or in Alabama, at enormous personal risk. When she went to the University of Alabama, the officials told her that they can't guarantee her safety on campus. Can you imagine an official today at a university saying to a reporter, I can't? So I think in some respects that's her greatest achievement, having gotten there and seen things. I think her longest lasting achievement, the one that affects us today, is a fundamental understanding that mirrors in some ways the popularity of the movie Selma. If you look at the white press, the mainstream press's portrayal of the civil rights legislative victories, they're often reported as munificent gifts being given to African Americans, a very passive notion. Ethel Payne's reporting was a constant reminder that these were rights that belong to African Americans, and we are winning them, we are taking them, we are seeking them, much more in an active sense. And I think that's one of the reasons why, to this day, if we look back, we have such differences in polling data between African Americans and white Americans, because white Americans' media taught them a very different story of the civil rights movement. And Selma and Ethel Payne's story tell us the one about how it was everyday people who stood up at enormous risk to win these rights and frequently were being denied them, that the rights never were fully conveyed. And so in some ways, Ethel Payne's journalism, reporting that, might be her long-lasting historical legacy, because it affects us today. But her greatest journalistic achievement, I think, was being the first to see certain things that everybody else was missing.
Amazing. Thank you so much. What a fabulous story that you have crafted with Eye on the Struggle. And thank you so much for writing this to you know,
it was a great journey, and it's great to be able to talk about her work.
Thank you. And thank you, the audience, for joining us for this segment of Arts Talk with James McGrath Morris.